Hello and welcome to this episode of PsychBiz. In this video, what we'll be doing is we'll be looking at the biological approach to psychology. We'll be looking at some of the key aspects of biopsych, including genes, biological structures and neurochemistry. We're going to learn lots of specialist terminology in this episode, including genotype and phenotype and many more. We'll finish this video with some ways we can evaluate the biological approach to psychology.
1, 2, 3.
This biopsych video is going to run a bit longer than most videos. This is because the specification is quite broad in what you need to know about the biological approach. But many of the ideas that we're going to talk about in this video will be used across your psychology course. So I suggest you spend some time making sure you really understand each section. But also keep in mind you can come back to this video if a biological aspect of another video leaves you a little confused. So let's break this down a little bit. We're going to look first at the influence of genes on behaviour. We talk about the inheritance of genotypes, their expression as physical and behavioural phenotypes. We'll then go on to discuss the evolutionary basis of inherited behaviour, before moving on to biological structures. Now there are a number of biological structures, and we're going to start with the endocrine system, which is a hormonal communication system in the body. We'll then talk about neurons. We'll talk about the distinction between the central and peripheral nervous system. We'll break down some areas of the brain and discuss their functions. And we'll also talk about the reflex arc. This is a set of neurons called the sensory relay and motor neurons, and we'll talk about the interaction between them. And then finally we'll talk about neurochemistry. This is a communication between neurons in a structure called the synapse. And in talking about how this communication happens, we'll mention something called summation. So first, the influence of genes on our behaviour. We need to make the distinction between a genotype and a phenotype. A genotype is our genetic code itself. So the genetic code for a physical characteristic or a behavioural characteristic. So this could be height if it's physical, it could be aggression if it's behavioural. Now what we might be able to do to find out a genotype is do some genetic testing. If we have our genetic code mapped out, we might be able to identify the particular set of genes which matches a characteristic. Just because you have the genotype for growing tall, it doesn't necessarily mean that you will grow tall. The expression of the characteristic, the actual growing tall, is called your phenotype. To grow tall, you would need the genotype of tallness, but there's an interaction with the environment. Perhaps you didn't have a particularly good diet as you were growing up, therefore you remained short. So even though you had the genotype to grow tall, your phenotype didn't express that. So it is possible to have a different phenotype from your genotype. So when we're looking into this area of genes, our classic study for psychologists to use is a twin study. And this is because twins can either be monozygotic, meaning identical twins, or dizygotic, meaning non-identical. Monozygotic twins have 100% of their genes, so 100% of their genotypes in common. Effectively what we have are two clones. However, dizygotic twins only share about 50% of their genes, and this isn't any different from any other sibling. So what we'd be interested in looking at in twin studies is something called the concordance rate. Concordance rate is the likelihood of one twin having a characteristic if the other twin definitely has the characteristic. So it's a measure of correlation. If one has it, does the other have it? Concordance rate for something like eye colour for monozygotic twins should be 100%. If one twin has blue eyes, the other twin should have blue eyes. So we know the genotype that codes for blue eyes is always expressed as the phenotype of having blue eyes. Now we're very interested in concordance rate when it comes to behavioural characteristics. According to one study, schizophrenia has a 48% concordance rate in monozygotic twins, compared to 4% in dizygotic twins. If we have a concordance rate that's higher in monozygotic twins than dizygotic twins, it does indicate a potential genetic component to that behaviour, because both sets of monozygotic and dizygotic twins should share a similar family environment. They should have similar nurture effects. They'll have a similar diet, a similar education level, and be treated the same. The only difference is the number of genes that are shared between the siblings. So if schizophrenia has a 48% concordance rate for monozygotic twins, it does indicate quite a strong likelihood that there is a genetic factor in the development of schizophrenia. However, it clearly isn't only genetic, because if it was solely genetic, we would expect to see a concordance rate of 100%. There must be some interaction with the environment in the development of schizophrenia. So concordance rate is a term that's going to come up again and again as we go through our psychology course, and it's important to be aware of its meaning. Another term that's important for us to know is something called the diaphysis stress response. This is the idea that a disorder is a result of an interaction between pre-existing vulnerability, and this could be maybe your genetic genotype, so the genotype for schizophrenia. But it isn't just that pre-existing vulnerability that causes the disorder. There has to be an interaction with the environment for the disorder to happen. There's an interaction between the pre-existing vulnerability of the genetic genotype and an environmental stressor. So this, in the case of schizophrenia, might be personal loss, maybe child abuse, or maybe drug use. And the combination of those factors has caused the disorder. And this could be true for high levels of aggression, for OCD, for depression, and for schizophrenia and many other psychological disorders. On to evolution and behaviour. So a few basic principles about evolution first. Evolution is the development of each successive generation of natural organisms. But the development of those generations is because of an adaptation to the environment. Our understanding of evolution primarily comes from Darwin and his theory of natural selection. So Darwin states that individuals within a species, they'll vary slightly due to genetic differences. Now, some variances will be quite suited to the environment, and some variances won't be. The variances that are most suitable for the environment will give us survival and therefore a reproductive advantage for those individuals with those beneficial variances. These are the genes that are most likely to be passed on to the next generation. They could be physical variances or they could be behavioural variances. So these are inherited characteristics. As I say, they could be physical, like bigger muscles, or it could be behavioural adaptations, such as a stronger or weaker fear response. One example for attachment, and you might have seen this before studying psychology, is that when animals, such as geese or ducks, first hatch, the first big object they see, they'll imprint on them, and they'll follow that large object as best they can. In nature, this is a very useful survival advantage. The first large object a hatchling is going to see is likely going to be its mother. Imprinting on that large object and following it will probably lead it to food, and therefore more likely to survive. Any birds that don't imprint likely will get lost and will die. The evolutionary argument for relationships, people are attracted to characteristics that are going to lead to reproductive success and going to lead to healthy children that will go on to have children of their own. So this could be indications of physical health or indication of mental intelligence. And from aggression as a behavioural response is actually quite useful as a survival advantage. If you're naturally aggressive, you might be more likely to survive due to being able to protect yourself from predators and other humans. You might have an increased ability to be able to gain resources and perhaps attract mates. Therefore, those humans that are more aggressive pass on their genes, leading to more aggressive humans later on. Let's now look at some biological structures. This is going to be relatively in brief because there's an entire unit on biological psychology. However, I do want to mention them in brief because the specification says to use them here, but also because they'll come in useful as we progress through other areas of psychology. So first up, the endocrine system. All I'll mention is the endocrine system is a chemical messaging system that's distributed across the body. It releases various hormones that enter the bloodstream, and the chemical messages it sends are slower than the nervous system, which we'll look at in a moment, but the effects are longer lasting. The endocrine system is controlled by the pituitary gland, and this is based in the brain. This controls the release of hormones from the other glands. The only other gland I'll mention now is the adrenal gland, and this is based just above the kidneys. The adrenal gland releases adrenaline, and this is part of the fight or flight response. So adrenaline will increase heart rate, it will constrict your blood vessels, so increasing the blood flow through your body and raising your blood pressure. This is going to give you the energy you need, potentially to run away or fight. It's going to divert blood away from your skin, so if you get cut you won't bleed out, and away from your kidneys and digestive system, which aren't going to need to work as you're trying to escape. We'll leave the endocrine system here, but if you'd like to know more, there is an entire video on the endocrine system in the Biopsych video series. We're going to look briefly now at something called the reflex arc. This is a structure of nerve cells which demonstrate how nerves work across the body. So the reflex arc is a collection of cells, transmits information from the source of the information, so this could be perhaps your fingertip if you touch something hot. It then will decide a response, such as moving the finger away from the hot plate, and then it will send a message to the muscle to actually move the finger. So let's look at this in a bit more detail. We have at the top the sensory neuron. Branching area on the left are the dendrites, which will detect the information. The message then passes along what's known as the axon to the next nerve cell. Just before it gets to the next nerve cell, it needs to pass a synapse, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But this structure is called the sensory neuron because it takes information from the senses. And this could be information from your taste buds, from photoreceptors in your eye, or pain receptors in your skin, or a range of other sensory inputs. The next neuron in this loop is called the relay neuron. And relay neurons connect with lots of other neurons. These relay neurons are mostly found in the brain, in the central nervous system. Their job is to analyze the sensations coming from the sensory neuron, interpret the meaning of that sensation, decide on a response, and pass that information on. Once the relay neuron, in communication with many other relay neurons, has decided on a response, it will then send the message down through what's known as the motor neuron. The motor neuron will be attached to an effector. So a part of the body it will stimulate into action. Again, there's a whole video on the reflex arc and the neuron, which will tell you what each part of the neuron is actually for. And this is in the biopsych video series, and I really suggest that you watch that as soon as you can. This is a place where the relay neuron and the motor neuron meet, but this is true of the connection points between any two individual neurons. This structure is called the synapse. So you can see it here. This long bulb is at the end of where the relay neuron was, and we'll call this the presynaptic cell. The next cell over is called the postsynaptic cell, and as you can see, there's a clear gap between them. Now, as the message passes through the neurons, it's taken as an electrical message. This electrical message, though, can't jump the gap between the presynaptic cell and the postsynaptic cell. So it has to transfer into a chemical message. The action potential travels down the presynaptic neuron's axon. This causes those little bubbles that you can see in the structure to release neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. Now you can see on the postsynaptic cell there are small structures, and these are called receptors. Neurotransmitters that are detected on these receptors are going to influence whether the postsynaptic neuron fires or not. So what are neurotransmitters? These are little chemical messages that work within the synaptic cleft. Neurotransmitters can be inhibitory, like, for example, serotonin. Inhibitory neurotransmitters make the postsynaptic neurons less likely to fire and pass on that action potential. However, excitatory neurotransmitters, for example dopamine, make the postsynaptic neurons more likely to fire an impulse. This is a process called summation. So summation is the net effect, the overall effect of inhibitory and excitatory influences on this postsynaptic neuron, making it either more or less likely to fire. So if the net effect is excitatory, if there are more excitatory influences on the postsynaptic neuron, then it's more likely to fire. But if the net effect was inhibitory, there are more inhibitory neurotransmitters on the postsynaptic cell, then the neuron's less likely to fire. So you can see in this diagram, I've put a range of inhibitory and excitatory neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft, and you can see some of them have been detected at the postsynaptic cell. And that's how the message is passed from one cell to the next. What happens then is the neurotransmitters are taken back into the presynaptic cell, ready to be released again for the next message. However, this structure which is impacted by a range of drugs that are used to control neurological disorders. For example, reuptake inhibitors. So a reuptake inhibitor like an SSRI, they'll keep serotonin in the synaptic cleft. As the neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft, that means it's more effective. An SSRI will increase serotonin's calming inhibitory function. Now there's no getting away from the fact that this is a very complex mechanism, and it may take 3, 4, 5 times of going over this structure before you understand how each of it falls together. Don't be intimidated if you don't understand it right away. I also have another video on the biopsych unit, which maybe you should watch, which might give you a slightly different perspective. But it's certainly one of the hardest parts of psychology to understand, so it might be worth making what notes you can now, and then coming back to the video a couple of times to solidify that knowledge. Let's talk about the distinction between the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. So the nervous system as a whole is the entire collection of nerve cells across the body that sends electrical messages. It's split into the peripheral nervous system, which is where the information from the sensors across the body come towards the brain, and also decisions from the brain are passed to different areas of the body. Your central nervous system is the area that makes decisions, and it contains the brain and the spinal cord. So it takes the information from the peripheral nervous system, it will process it, make decisions, and then pass that information back. Now your specification at this point doesn't explicitly say that we need to know about the different structures of the brain at this point, but I really do want to introduce the basics of the brain. After all, psychology is the study of the brain and behaviour, and I don't want its overall structure to be a mystery to us as we continue on through the course. So here's a brief overview. At the bottom of the brain we can see here the brain stem. Now the brain stem is our most basic evolutionary part of our brain, and because of that it deals with our most basic functions. So it controls our heart rate, it controls our breathing rate, our sleeping pattern, and our levels of hunger. So as you can see, all the functions that we will share with the most basic animals. It also has the function of connecting the brain to the spinal cord and then onwards to the rest of the body. And just underneath the largest part of our brain we have the cerebellum. The cerebellum receives information from sensory systems across our body, from the spinal cord and from other parts of the brain. We need to regulate our motor movements, and it's important in balance. Now this largest part of our brain is called the cerebrum. The outer skin of any organ is called a cortex, and in the brain of humans The skin is about 2.5 millimeters, quite a thin skin. Now, as you might be able to see from this diagram, the cerebral cortex is folded to increase its surface area. The cerebral cortex contains the cell bodies of neurons and the connections between them, and this is called grey matter. White matter is the long axonal fibres that connect different areas of the brain. The cerebral cortex is thought to include a range of areas that control memory, attention, perception, your awareness, language and consciousness. It's broken down to 4 main areas. At the back of your head you've got the smallest area. This is called the occipital lobe, and its job is to process visual stimuli, so colour, shape, orientation. So for example, the colour of objects, the shape of objects, and the orientation of objects in 3D space. The parietal lobe, which runs across the top of the brain, has the job of regulating sensory information which is coming across the body, and is also used in the manipulation of physical objects. The temporal lobes run across the side of the head, and they're important in auditory perception, so the ability to hear. This means processing the noise that comes into the ears and turning it into understandable patterns, so for example words. This is also the area of the brain used for memory, in particular declarative memory, so memories of facts that you can state. For example, Paris is the capital of France. And lastly, we have the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is where our higher order thinking comes from, when you predict future consequences, or when areas of your brain suggest that you do a particular action that you know to be socially unacceptable, it can override those decisions, such as aggressive responses, which come from the amygdala in the limbic system. Biopsych is an area of psychology where it's important to know a lot of things, so there's less of a focus on studies and direct evaluation. However, biopsych as an approach has got really strong links to a range of issues and debates in psychology, and we're going to talk about them briefly here. So the concept of biological determinism. So a quick reminder of what determinism is. Determinism is the idea that we're not in control of our own actions. They're already set in some way by the nature of our psychology. Biological determinism is the idea that our behaviour is causally driven by internal natural processes such as the influence of genes and neurotransmitters. If our behaviour is due to genes and neurotransmitters, it means our behaviour is predictable based on those factors. And if our behaviour is predictable based on our genes and neurotransmitters, then we don't have the free will to control our own actions. Also, it links to the reductionism and holism debate. What the biological approach does is it tries to reduce the explanation for really complex behaviours down to quite simple biological elements. Now, this is based on the scientific principle of parsimony. And this is the idea that a complex phenomena should be tried to be explained in the simplest way possible, an approach that's had a lot of success in the natural sciences such as physics. However, it could be argued that humans are just simply too complex to be reduced down to simple biological elements. The biopsychology approach also fully comes down the nature side of the nature-nurture debate. So nature processes such as influence of genes, neurotransmitters and brain structure is what results in any given behaviour. And the biopsych approach minimises any role of the environment, such as cultural pressures or social learning theory effects. One more issue in debate that biopsych's linked to is the idiographic versus nomothetic debate. Biopsych is a very nomothetic way of looking at psychology. What the biological approach to psychology attempts to do is take a very quantitative, scientific approach. This means studying large groups of people in an attempt to form general laws of behaviour that we can use to apply across a big population. This has been really useful because it's led to effective drug treatments. The biological approach uses very objective scientific measurements. For example, it will measure neurotransmitter levels, or look at the structure of the brain in very precise detail. We could argue this increases the validity of the findings of biopsychologists, whereas other psychologists might use techniques that are more open to subjectivity and bias. The biological approach to psychology has certainly created a range of drugs which have helped some people cope with debilitating psychological disorders such as OCD or schizophrenia. And biological theories of psychology are usually backed up by a large number of empirical studies. But a downside of the biological approach, linking to ideas of reductionism, is that it's a very mechanistic way of explaining behaviour. There's no consideration of any internal mental processes, thoughts, in explaining behaviour. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a like. If you haven't already, click subscribe to be updated with new videos. And also, if you have any questions about the content covered during this video, please drop a comment in the comments below. If you see a question and you think you can answer it, then please give that a go as well. Thank you very much. Until the next episode of PsychBoost.